Thank you for joining us. We're joined by political consultant Eric Hacopian. We'll be discussing the political situation in the country, the situation regarding the military, and what may have caused Armenia's military defeat. Eric, thank you again for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So how is the war being used by different political forces in Armenia in this post-war period?
There's a famous line from President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a U.S. attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro that failed and was his first failure as a president. And he said that the victory has 1,000 fathers and defeats an orphan. So I'm not surprised at all that this issue is being used as a political football by different forces. In fact, war is actually, politics, just politics through the barrel of a gun. It's actually the ultimate political act. So it obviously was going to be used by different political forces for their own purposes to advance their agendas. That's no surprise, and it should be expected by everyone. Obviously, from the opposition, it's used to discredit and show the ineptness of the current government in its conduct of the war, decisions made prior to the war, decisions made during the war, decisions made after the war. So they're obviously having a field day, given the scale of the defeat, to use this for their own purposes. I don't know how effectively they're using it, because I think given how discredited some of these people are, i.e. people tied to the old regime, it makes their lines of attack, problematic. But it's definite, and it's the primary issue that's caused a tremendous drop in support for the current government. And it is really far more so than other issues which pale in comparison to it, whether it's the economy or COVID. From the government side, what you see is it's sort of like what I call hiding behind soldiers. Because what they highlight is, and frankly, this is being done by the conscript people in the conscripts in the military themselves, who are coming out not in support of the prime minister, but in support of ending the war. And you constantly see this. You see it in their videos. You see them when they get to town. And I think that's somewhat dampened the sort of, we should have continued the war type conversation. There's hardly any of that. So I think the current government is sort of hiding behind what these soldiers were saying about the necessity of ending this war, while avoiding any conversations about the decisions they made before or after. It's just easier to hide behind heroes at this point.
And what is needed to depoliticize and cut through the fog of war and give the country the answer to these issues?
I think there's two tasks here. There's the task of the state, and there's the task of its citizenry, and Armenia being a country in which a lot of Armenians don't live in the country, it's also the job of the diaspora. On the government side, it's frankly very simple. You need to have a truth commission set up immediately that will look into the decisions that were made during the war, and have a free hand in pursuing wherever it leads to. If it leads to the current administration, well, so be it. If it leads to ineptness on military leadership, so be it. If it leads to whoever's office it leads to, if it leads to the former regime, so be it. So what we need is unbiased professionals that have the trust of the public, and frankly, I think many of these people can or should come from abroad, because we have a lot of Armenian or other military experts who should come in and look at everything. And in short order, they need to answer the primary questions of what caused this, no matter who is blamed. And two, come up with a set of recommendations. This is not that unusual. In 1973, when Israel had a population that was roughly ours, and they roughly had the same level of casualties that we had in this war, even though we don't know the exact figures. And 73 was a catastrophe for them. It was an intelligence failure, military failure. And in 3 months, they had a review with recommendations: who was at fault, who needed to be removed, and what are the steps moving forward. And all of this can be done. I think on the level of average individuals and citizens, I think what's needed is humility. We should not talk about things that we do not fully know. The truth is, there's a lot of things in war that we will not know 20, 30 years until after 20, 30 years have passed. There's many things about World War II that were not known for years. For example, during World War II that the British had broken the German codes, so Churchill went to sleep every night knowing which British city was going to be flattened that night. But he had to make the decision that that's worth it because that information is worthwhile to know in the future. So these are the really hard, terrible decisions political leaders need to make. So for us to sit here and anybody, I mean, my standard is if anybody talks definitively about what they know, this is the way it exactly happened, they don't know what they're talking about because we don't know what really happened. And until an inquiry is done, we will never know. So we should stop speculating. We should have humility, and we should conduct ourselves with at least with the level of dignity of the young men that fought like hell to make sure the worst doesn't happen and allow us to have this conversation today. Let's keep that standard as our standard.
But bearing that in mind, what do we actually factually know about how the war was conducted? Do we have enough information yet to have a concrete understanding?
I think we need to, again, I'm going to hold myself to the same standard, so I will only deal in generalities. I will deal in generalities that almost everybody agrees to, or at least the people who are knowledgeable about military affairs agree to. And that is that the primary variable in this war was the Turkish leadership of the Azeri army. Essentially, after their humiliation in the Tavush fighting in July, Aliyev handed over the keys to his military to the Turks. They ran it, they ran every part of it, they brought in their drone systems, they ran the drone systems themselves, they brought in their air force, they brought in their special forces, they brought in the terrorists from Syria and Libya and other places. So that the Turkish leadership was the primary difference in this war. The second one is the impact of the impact of drones, which is obviously clear and everybody understands that. The fact that they had effective drones, and we either didn't have it or we never used it, or we didn't know how to respond to it properly or in time. The third one is what matters in modern warfare is speed and mobility. It's controlling the air, speed, and mobility, which was their special forces that allowed them to make breakthroughs that in any static warfare, they would not have made those breakthroughs. One thing that if you look at the front, wherever there was static warfare, our guys held. Wherever there was movement, we were in retreat. So obviously, that's the variable in war. And the last thing, which I get this, and I've talked about this before, is the best part of our army were the 18, 19-year-old conscripts that if they were boys, they turned into men very quickly. And which is, on the one hand, heroic, but on the other hand, if they were actually the best of our army, that's pretty sad because they shouldn't be the best of our army. So those are the four things that we know in generalities. But I think anything beyond going into specifics, I'm not going to go there because we simply don't know enough.
And what about the POW situation? That's been spoken about a lot recently.
Yes, obviously, we have all seen the horrific videos. We don't know when these things come from. Obviously, when you see videos like that, you're very worried about the people that we know are prisoners of war. I think the numbers are somewhere in the 20s, if I'm not mistaken. That's somewhat also convoluted with the fact that there were civilians in the first couple of days right after the ceasefire that were seized, people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. So there's a lot of, frankly, confusion. But unfortunately, this is being driven by the lack of cooperation from the Azeri side with the International Red Cross and with us to exchange bodies. Now, why they're doing this, I have no idea. We have no way of knowing what their motivations are. I think one of the motivations might be that since they have far greater number of casualties, they want to delay the exchange of bodies because nobody wants, even if you win a war, you don't want 4,000 funerals over a weekend. So we don't know what it is. Obviously, this is something that should be on the top of the agenda of the government in being vigilant, raising this issue. There's no reason to have prisoners of wars and that they should be exchanged. We have their prisoners of war, which we know for a fact are treated much better than our guys are. So obviously we have a vested interest to get them out as quickly as possible. But at the end of the day, you can blame our side as much as you want, but they need to negotiate with some kind of a neo-fascist state on the other side who doesn't do anything on humanitarian grounds.
And how has the public's perception changed regarding the army in this post-war period?
Well, I mean, I think we need to divide two things here. There's the soldiers and there's the army. There's two different things.
As an institution.
As far as our soldiers are concerned, they are considered universal heroes. I don't think no one will doubt that, especially our young guys and women who were there fighting in the front line. So that is not even an issue. So I want to be clear about that. But the army as an institution has taken a huge fall because there was always this perception that a lot of things don't work in this country, especially during the old regime. There's a lot of problems, ineptness, stupidity, mediocrity. But, you know, the army is the exception. I believe that. Many other people believed it. But I think in hindsight, that was wishful thinking. Generally, if there's mediocrity or there's poor management or lack of thinking in other departments, why would the army be an exception? And I think that was more wishful thinking on our part than reality. And we learned that the hard way. So I think the Army's credibility, again, this is the leadership and not your fighting forces, has taken a dramatic fall. And it can only be, and it needs to be repaired because the Army is obviously an exceptionally important institution. But you will not repair it unless you're entirely honest with people. And the other part is that we have learned during the war is that they were lying to us. So that needs to be rebuilt, but it can only be rebuilt by honesty.
But in this post-war period, what should we make of the behavior of the military and political leadership of Armenia?
I'm going to give you a simple answer that pains me. That is that our men and women were led into battle by people who were not worthy of leading them. Both, I'm talking about the entirety of the political class, and I'm talking about obviously what we learned also of most of the military. And I think we have to be careful here is because you can't even blame all of the military leadership because that's a very broad term. I'm sure there were fantastic colonel level, local level leaders who, you know, did fantastic things. So we need to be very careful when we're talking about this and not generalize. So when I speak of leadership, I'm talking about the top people, not, you know, an average commander that could have been exceptionally good, that did heroic things. So we need to be very careful when we're talking about this. But as a general rule, the people we sent to battle deserved a lot better.
Well, Eric, thank you as always.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.